Tonight here at the Port St. Lucie Church of Christ. Tonight I'd like to speak a little bit about when our knowledge exceeds our understanding. So just think about that for a second. When our knowledge exceeds our understanding. Have you ever been in a situation where you understand what needs to be done through a process, but you don't really understand what that process is doing? Think about it for math. You can go through and put together and go through the strokes, do all the mathematical equations, but you can't go through and you don't understand what it is that it's actually solving. Well, same thing with spiritually. We create enormous danger when we have sound knowledge of God's facts and truth, but have little or no knowledge of God's actual purpose. Think about that for a second. We know all the facts, but we don't know what God's purpose is. That danger existed from the time of Adam and Eve's rebellion against God in the Garden of Eden. The same danger intensified and rose to a new level when Jesus was born. That danger was clearly evident in Jesus' ministry. The Pharisees knew God's facts, but they did not know God's purpose. The 12 disciples understood the new facts from God, but they did not understand God's purpose. The same danger intensified again and rose still to a higher level when Jesus died and was raised from the dead. The danger is as real and powerful today as it has ever been. Now, I want you to understand that danger and consider how it exists for us personally as a congregation by studying Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 through 23. This is what Bobby had quoted here. Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 through 23. And in Matthew chapter 16, starting at 13 there, when Jesus came to the congregation of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, saying, "What do men say that I, the Son of God, or Son of Man, am?" So they said, "Some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, and others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets." And he said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered and said, "You are Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus answered and said to him, "Blessed are you, son Bar-Jonah. The flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whenever you bind on earth, you will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he commanded his disciples, and they should tell him no one that he was Jesus Christ. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and be raised the third day. Then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "Far be it from you, Lord, that this shall not happen to you." But he turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are an offense to me. You are not mindful of these things of God, but things of men." Now in Matthew chapter 16, we find Jesus is one of those rare moments when just he and the 12 disciples were together. They were in the northernmost section of the area of Philistine in the region of Caesarea Philippi. Jesus' work, miracles, and teachings generated lots of conversation. Jesus was the main topic of conversation, obviously, among the Jewish people. Now, how do you explain this unusual man who did all these things that had never been done before? Were these acts of Satan, as the Pharisees claimed, or were these acts of God? Jesus asked these 12 men, "What are you saying about me? Who do they think I am?" And the 12 responded, "Oh, they say you are several different people. Some say you are John the Baptist, who obviously who died and executed back in Matthew chapter 14. Others say you are the prophet Elijah, who had also been dead for centuries. Still others say that you're Jeremiah, who had also been dead for centuries. And some just say that you're just one of the prophets. You're just one of these guys that are out there. Now Jesus asked the second question. What do you say about me? Who do you think that I am? Peter answered very specifically, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Peter said that Jesus was the person God had promised Israel that he would send from the time of Abraham. He was the living God's son. Jesus responded to Peter with a very imperative statement or impressive statement. You are blessed. You don't know this because some other person told you this. You know this because my Father in heaven revealed it to you. This was not knowledge through instruction. This was knowledge through revelation. Peter knew something that God caused him to know. Peter, upon this rock, I will build my church. We've all heard that verse lots of times. Death won't stop me. It will keep me from bringing into existence my called out people. It will not keep from bringing into my existence my called out people. I'm giving you the keys to the kingdom to bind and loose on earth. He made the same statement in all 12 in Matthew chapter 18, verse 18. It says, assuredly I say to you, whenever you bind on earth, you will be bound in heaven. And whatever you loose on earth, you will be loosed in heaven. That is an astounding statement for Jesus to make to any person. Peter, you understand something the other 12 do not understand. You understand it because God himself revealed it to you. You understand a fact, a truth so important that I'm going to use this truth to create my own people who will submit to me as their king. Nothing will stop me from creating my own people, not even death. And Peter, I'm giving you the keys to open the doors to those who have become my people so they can be part of my kingdom. He's given them the keys. Think about that for a second. What you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. What you free on earth will be freed in heaven. Now, if Jesus made those statements to you, would that mess with your mind just a little bit? Would that cause you just to think and say, whoa, I've got all this knowledge now, I don't know what the purpose is? But wow, that's kind of mind-blowing, right? Would it make you feel more important than you are? Would it make you feel like you knew more than anyone else? More than you actually knew? Would it cause you to believe that you understood things that others were not able to understand? In effect, Peter liked it probably. It affected Peter like it probably affected most of us. Since God revealed something to him, since Jesus had given him the keys to the kingdom, he concluded that he knew and understood more than Jesus did. Immediately after this conversation, Jesus began to explain to his disciples the sequence of events that would happen. He would travel to the city of Jerusalem. The Jewish leaders would cause him a lot of suffering. He would be killed, and he would be resurrected from death on that third day. The Peter, to whom God had given the revelation of knowledge, to whom Jesus gave the keys of the kingdom to, now was certain that he understood what God would do better than Jesus did. God had revealed to him who Jesus was, so he knew what God wanted to do in his mind. He did not like Jesus saying these things. This was not what God had planned for Jesus. He knew what was supposed to happen and what was going to happen, and God revealed to him the knowledge, the truth about Jesus Christ. Now, why wouldn't he believe that what he saw in the future for Jesus was not also the revelation from God? For centuries, God had promised Israel a Messiah, a Christ. Israel was God's chosen people, the people God promised Abraham. Jesus was the Christ that God had promised Israel. Now Jesus would become the ruler, the king of Israel, and bring Israel to a new level of existence of power. Then God would do with Israel whatever God planned to do through Israel and through Jesus as Israel's king. That was how it would happen. Peter had it all figured out. Peter was sure of this too. That was God's revelation. I can see Peter thinking to himself, I know this just like I knew Jesus Christ, or Jesus is the Christ. Since he was a disciple, he certainly did not want to be disrespectful to Jesus in front of other disciples. So he took Jesus aside privately, and he began to rebuke Jesus. Lord, you're wrong about this. You're not helping anything by making statements like that. That kind of talk has got to stop. You must stop saying things like that. This will not happen. God will not let it happen. You are not going to be killed. The one person whom God had made a revelation had spoken. Then Jesus, who told Peter and had received a revelation, had something else to tell Peter. Satan, get behind me. You're a stumbling block for me. Basically that bait stick in a trap, you know? Peter's rebuke was serious, agonizing, and tempting to Jesus. The thought of not having to die was powerful and appealing to Jesus physically. But Peter, your mind is not focused on God's interests or God's concerns. There is no way that Peter regarded his concern a human concern instead of a divine concern. Now, this whole incident on how things played out was a little shocking. You might ask, what about this incident that shakes you up? First, the same disciple within a few days would boast God's spokesman who recognized that Jesus was God's son and Satan's spokesman opposing God's purpose in Jesus. Second, when he spoke for Satan, he did not know it. He sincerely believed that he was speaking for God. Third, he was so certain that he had God's plans for Jesus figured out that he dared to rebuke the Son of the living God. Fourth, he thought that he was 100% focused on God's purposes and objectives when he was actually 100% focused on the human purposes and objectives. Fifth, he was 100% confused and did not know it. He believed that he was devoted to God's interests when the truth was that he was devoted to his human interests. I don't know about you, but this kind of sobers me pretty deeply. We can know the facts and truths about God and fail to understand his purposes. Even though we understand the facts and the truths, even though we are devoted disciples to Christ, we can be religiously speaking for Satan when we think we are speaking for God. We can be so certain that we have God's desires and purposes figured out that we can still take Jesus aside and tell him that what he said is not what God planned. We can think we are 100% focused on God's priorities, God's plans, and God's purposes when we're actually focused on our own concerns. We can be totally confused about God's purposes and never even realize it. Now, I don't have the words to tell you how sobering that I find that myself and for the church, but just think about that for a moment. Think about how our greatest intentions can sometimes lead us astray if we don't understand the full purpose there. Now, understanding what God wants us to be is simpler than understanding what God wants to accomplish through us. Knowing what God wants me to be is simpler than understanding what God wants me to do. Know what God wants the church to be is simpler to understand than what God wants the church to do. It is easy to come to the conclusion that God's greatest concern, or God's only concern, is what God wants us to be. It's easy to conclude that it is not important to serve God's purpose to what it is to be what God wants us to be. It's easy to conclude that God's purpose are obvious and simple. But I don't want you to draw the conclusion, if you were to look at Jesus' life, look at Jesus' ministry, and look at the people Jesus has helped and the way he helped them. If Jesus teaches us anything, he teaches us that you cannot divorce God's will from God's purpose. Israel never really understood that. They thought God loved them. Understanding God's purpose is not simple. It obviously never has been. May we never forget the danger of knowing the facts and truths about the will of God without understanding God's purpose. God may someday point out in ways in which you are an obstacle to his purpose. We can hinder his purpose when we don't understand what his purpose is. We must study. We must grow. To do this, we can show ourselves approved. Now, if you'd like to become one with God, please come forward as we stand and sing.